Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Magdi Hanna. I am the chairman and CEO of the International Institute for Software Testing. I am pleased to be the host for this webinar today on testing and DevOps, The Future is Here, by Adam Auerbach, the Vice President and the co-head of Cloud and Dev Test SecOps practices at EPAM Systems. We're excited that you are able to join us today and set aside an hour to attend this webinar. This webinar is sponsored by the International Institute for Software Testing, the leader in education-based certifications and training. For more information about what IIST can help you with, please go to our website at testinginstitute.com. You may submit your questions at any time during this webinar by using the question box in your GoToWebinar window. Our speaker will try to answer as many questions as he can during the presentation, as well as at the end of the presentation. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available for viewing early next week at testinginstitute.com. At the end of the webinar, you will be asked to complete a short survey. At IIST, we strive to provide the highest quality education resources for the public. So please take a few minutes to fill out the survey. I will now turn the webinar over to our speaker today, Adam Auerbach. Adam?
Awesome. Thank you, Magdi. So as Magdi said, I am the co-head of what we call our Cloud and Dev Test SecOps practice at EPAM Systems. EPAM is a global system integrator. We have many clients across North America and in Europe. Most of our resources are based in Eastern Europe. The Cloud and Dev Test SecOps practice is relatively newer at EPAM, and we put it together about a year and a half ago because, as I'm going to explain, there's a lot of overlap between people's journey to the cloud and DevOps transformation and the work that has to occur within testing. Before joining EPAM, I was at Lincoln Financial, where I led their quality and DevOps practice, and then before that, I was at Capital One, and I was part of Capital One's journey to Agile, transforming testing, helping them get to implement DevOps through system teams, and then ultimately getting to continuous delivery. I have, you can follow me on Twitter at Bugman31, and I do also write a bunch of articles for TechWell. So I just want to start just kind of like level setting, where we see many companies. A lot of times QA organizations are organized by lines of business. So typically what we see is that if you have a centralized testing team, you have QA leadership by line of business, and the testers are organized along with those lines. And those testers are doing some mix of manual and automation. And then they have an enterprise group of engineers who are doing the automation, performance, and security, the frameworks, maybe even some of the automation for regression, the execution, doing performance and security. So the problem with this setup is that it creates constraints on the lines of business teams. So if the lines of business teams want to be able to run regression or make changes, like they become dependent on that enterprise body. So this is a problem. As part of this problem, when people start to transition to Agile, we start to see this type of pattern where we have several sprints of testing and development followed by some mix of hardening, where they're doing regression, performance, and security, everything to get ready for a release. And so while this is probably better than where they were coming from for Waterfall, this is still not really Agile. This is still Waterfall, right? And the goal here is, how do we get rid of that hardening phase? How do we be able to get code ready to go to production at the end of a sprint, or maybe every day within the sprint? So we need to be able to run regression. We need to be able to run performance and security. It has to run as part of the development process so that at the end of a sprint, we're ready to ship at minimum. And so this is where DevOps comes in. So technically, DevOps is development and operations coming together. We should all know that by now. I personally like to think of DevOps as a philosophy around how do we deliver high quality software faster. And so basically that philosophy drives a lot of where we try to make improvements and make decisions. And so in this construct that I'm setting up here, if you think about the Agile team, while they can do development and testing, in many cases they have to rely on another group to do, maybe to stand up their environments, to approve their architecture for what they're building, or maybe there's some other group that's going to do the deployments or support it in prod, or maybe some of the production fixes, or there's some other group that's doing performance and security testing. And so when you look at all of these enterprise services supporting the team, they become bottlenecks. And this is where this philosophy comes into play. DevOps is about flow. And to improve flow within this construct, the Agile team has to be able to do everything for themselves. Now, that doesn't mean that from an infrastructure perspective, we're going to give all of the access to the team to be able to just deploy and stand up their own environments and just go. But what we will be doing is we want the infrastructure team, for example, to be able to containerize the environments, to script everything out. So that way the Agile team has a safe, controlled manner which they can then stand up their environments for themselves, or maybe make some customizations, but they're doing it themselves. The infrastructure team is just providing the construct to do that. The same thing for performance or security testing, being able to create a baseline set of performance tests that the Agile team can run themselves and customize and keep healthy versus doing it themselves. Like, this is what DevOps is about. It's about helping the teams move code as fast as possible with the highest quality and removing the impediments on other people within the organization from doing work for them. And so this is that philosophy that we're going to apply into testing, and I'll talk through more of how we enable this in the testing group. DevOps is just one step of this journey. So you move from Waterfall to Agile, you're going to get somewhat faster, and then we're going to start applying DevOps. We're going to start to automate the build and deployments. We're going to start to look at testing differently, and then that's going to make us faster. But in order to get to continuous delivery, and there's continuous delivery versus continuous deployment, many people aren't doing continuous deployment. Continuous deployment means your code is going to go all the way through to production without any human interaction. Most companies who are mature in this space are practicing continuous delivery, where your code goes through all of the automated gates to get to a place where it's ready to go to production. Maybe it goes to production, but it's in like an inactive environment, or it's turned off. So that's continuous delivery. In order to get to true continuous delivery, there are other things that have to be at play. You have to, most likely you're in the cloud, most likely you've implemented microservices, so that way you have a loosely coupled architecture. So without some fundamental changes, you won't get to continuous delivery with just doing DevOps. So it's DevOps is just one step in this process. To me, there are 5 principles around applying DevOps to your organization, whether it's testing or infrastructure or some other group. So the first one is build once, deploy many. So for some companies, we'll go in and we'll do like a QA workshop because they say, hey, we want to improve our testing practice. And what we do is we start with, tell us how you make the donuts, tell us how you write code and how it gets into your environments and the architecture. And sometimes what we find is that the branching pattern for the client is like an anti-pattern, in the sense that they have a different branch for each environment, or a different branch by project, or a different branch by their releases. And the problem with that is that every time they move code to a different branch, they invalidate the testing that occurred. And so we had one company where they said, well, we think our QA ratio is off because they were like 1-to-1. And what we found out was they were cherry picking code moving from branch to branch. And so the testing team really only had a couple days with the release candidate. And so of course the QA ratio is going to be high because they have a limited amount of time to really test the system fully. From a DevOps perspective, we want to be able to create like an automated factory, if you will, automated pipeline. And so to do that, we want to build the code once, and then it gets deployed to dev, it moves to QA, it moves to like a pre-prod, and then eventually to prod. And it's that same package that moves forward or it dies. And by doing that, we can have a set of tests that are building upon itself. And we don't have to restart the process because of how they're moving code. The second principle here is that we need to be able to enable self-service. So enterprise groups should not be doing work on behalf of the teams. Enterprise groups need to enable the teams to do stuff on their own. Like I mentioned before with infrastructure, the infrastructure team has to be able to create containers and infrastructure as code that the teams can leverage themselves to be able to stand up their environments. The same thing for testing. When one client, they had a team that was just doing the automation for regression. So they're writing the scripts and doing all the execution. So the first thing we said was, okay, the teams need to take over the capabilities of doing that. And those enterprise resources now should be focused on creating the frameworks, creating capabilities, doing research about new capabilities to bring in. This is the best way to make sure that your enterprise resources are doing the right work and that your teams have the accountability that they need to get things into production. And that kind of rolls into number 3, which is that your subject matter experts need to be there for support and best practices. So in this model, if I have enterprise resources that are automation experts, besides creating capabilities for the frameworks and tooling, they should have office hours, they should be doing lunch and learns. It's their responsibility to help make sure that the testers on these teams understand how to use the tooling, have all the education that they need to be able to do troubleshooting, really help manage the whole ecosystem. This is a big change. At some companies that I've been at, I've had people come to me and say, well, does this mean my job? Am I going to lose my job? Like, I'm an enterprise person who's doing performance testing. Is my job going to go away? And no, your job is going to change. And this is part of the organizational change management that has to go along with this type of transformation, is that you have to help educate people on the new ways of working and how it's going to make their job better. And frankly, your subject matter experts, who are your most technical people, they really want to spend their time, solving problems, finding new ways to work, and helping others versus just doing scripting for themselves. Number 4 is around bottlenecks. So if DevOps is about flow, we need to understand what are the bottlenecks in our process. How long does it take for code to get all the way through to production? Where are there manual steps? Where are we waiting for people? So we need to identify what they are, and we need to solve for them. I always look at DevOps transformations as just like uncovering the big boulders within our organization and how to remove them quickly. You need to find them quickly, and then you need to move them quickly. I have been at organizations where they have like a project mindset, and so in order to have anyone make any type of research and development, they would ask, what project do I log my time to? Well, innovation doesn't happen that way. You need people who want to work, who want to try new things, who want to spend time solving problems. And so one big boulder we had to solve for was, getting leadership to move away from a project mindset, so that everyone wasn't thinking where they log their time to, and be able to support change. The last one is around accountability. We're asking teams now to have, in the definition of done, testing and automation. So that means that when automation doesn't work, that developers are enabled to go and look at why it's failing and to fix it. If their code doesn't, if the pipeline breaks because of their code, then they need to be able to, go and solve those issues. So, getting developers to think differently, getting testers to think differently. Testers, you need to be able to look at the development of the application and understand the architecture, how to better write tests that are going to hit what specifically changed. So all of our roles are changing as part of this. We can't just be passing things between each other. So when we talk about how does DevOps affect testing, this is nirvana. This is where we want to get to, which is continuous testing. DevOps is going to drive your organization to build out an automated CI process, a continuous integration process, where when the developers check in their code, there's a set of steps that run to compile the code, run different analysis against it, package it up, stand up the infrastructure, and deploy it. And so then we need our tests to be part of this process. All of our tests that we run have to be automated. They have to be plugged into this pipeline, and in essence, be able to serve as quality gates in the pipeline. That way, our developers can get fast feedback to know that when something doesn't work or something does work, and when they need to step in to fix something. So everything that I'm going to talk about is around how do we get to continuous testing? How do we help enable automation in the pipeline, giving the developers fast feedback, and start to remove the manual interventions that we currently have? So continuous testing is a term that you might have heard many times before. A lot of times people confuse continuous testing with just test automation, but continuous testing is like the ultimate maturity. It means that all of your tests, functional, performance, integration, security, they're all automated. They're all part of your pipeline. And it's those automation suites which are making determination in the pipeline if it can continue to move forward or stop. So that's usually the big difference. Even when I joined EPAM, I had many projects coming to me saying, well, we do continuous testing. But then when I actually dug in, they had a CI pipeline, so they're using Jenkins, for example. They had a Jenkins job that kicked off their suite of tests, but then they required somebody to manually go in and figure out, like, why are the tests failing, or did the test pass, can the next step run? That's not continuous testing. So what do we have to do differently? How do we get there? So the first thing is being able to automate in real time. If you're only automating for regression, then you're going to be automating several sprints after your team has developed their code. And that's too slow. We need to be able to automate in real time. We need to be able to automate in parallel to the developers writing their code. And this is why a lot of times the most mature companies are practicing BDD, or behavioral driven development, or acceptance test driven development. So in this process, the product owner, the tester, developer, they sit down, they write acceptance tests using Gherkin, given, when, then format. Maybe they're using Cucumber or SpecFlow. Then the developers will go create the code. The tester will go create the automated tests. Then they'll sit back together. They'll run through the automated tests to make sure that everything passed, and then they're checking in working code and working automated tests. So this helps ensure that the tests are kept up to date, that they're part of the pipeline, and that testing is first-class citizen. Unit testing is very critical. Now, whether or not your company is doing test-driven development, I mean, that's a preference. Personally, to me, it's just a matter of having unit test at all, and having gates in the code or in the pipeline, so that way when developer checks in their code, there should be a check to say that all new code has a unit test, that you have a percentage for code coverage, because that's going to ensure a certain level of quality before it comes to QA. But this is how you're able to keep pace with development, by doing this type of automation. When you do real-time automation, you can't focus on just the UI. So on the left-hand side, you probably are aware, this is called the ice cream cone effect. When we take our manual test cases and we just try to automate them, what ends up happening is we get this huge suite of automation tests that take a long time to run, or they just provide a lot of false fails that take people time to triage, and it takes a lot of care and feeding. You will never get to continuous testing if you're only automating through the UI. You have to be able to automate at the API level, at component levels. You have to have unit tests. This is the only way that you're going to get to continuous testing, because when you properly implement the testing pyramid, you're able to create smaller suites of tests that run very quickly. And when they fail, you can spot the error again very quickly. If we have clients who have thousands of manual tests, who've spent time automating them, and what happens is, even if you are able to parallelize all of your execution, 4,000 tests that are automated are going to have like 1,000 failures. Well, that's going to take a small army of people to figure out why are they all failing, what's really a defect versus a framework issue, an environment issue, a data issue, whatever. And so the ROI for that automation is going to be very low. Frankly, I don't know that I've ever seen people get the ROI on automation when they only focus on UI. You have to be able to automate at the API level at a minimum. Sometimes there's there's UI tests that maybe don't even make sense to automate. Maybe it's just better to do it manual, or use a crowd, or do it in production. That's what some of our most mature clients are doing today. They're able to do blue-green deployments or canary builds, and they're able to use people in production to do some of the manual testing, because they have the right telemetry in production to be able to see errors and be able to shut something down or open it up to everybody else. So as you're building your automation, as you're integrating it into the pipeline, you also need to be able to take advantage of spinning up your environments. You need testers in this environment need to understand how to take advantage of the cloud. You need to be able to understand Docker or Kubernetes to be able to spin up your test environment. You need to be able to spin up browsers or devices. There's some great third parties. We have a partnership with Sauce Labs, but obviously there's Perfecta, there's BrowserStack, there's others. But you need to be able to instantiate your testing environments as part of your pipeline in order to be able to spread the tests across all of your required environments and bring in those results to determine whether or not you should move forward. And so as testers, we have to understand these technologies and how to take advantage of them. Okay, so now I have all these tests, they're in my pipeline, I'm running against all these environments, but I need data. And this is the one thing that I think is becoming even bigger issue now as we start to get faster. A lot of times people start with production data. So I have clients that will come to me and say, Adam, we use production data for testing, so we need to automate bringing down production data, scrubbing it, and injecting it into our non-prod environments. And when I was at Capital One, this was a very similar approach that we started with. The problem with production data is that it changes, it's very dynamic, and just the process of bringing it down and scrubbing it and keeping it secure and injecting it into your environments, that takes a long time. I mean, it's not going to be fast enough for you to get to continuous delivery. You really need to be able to take advantage of synthetic data. Now, granted, synthetic data isn't going to cover all of your use cases, but it should be able to do 80 to 90% of them. And so you need to be able to create data as part of your pipeline before you run your tests. This will allow you to take out of your automation. You should be able to remove all of your data conditioning steps and just focus on the assertions that you need to validate. At Capital One, as we moved into continuous testing and to continuous delivery, our applications were getting re-architected. And so more and more APIs became available. And what we were able to do is just to start to leverage the API that the application was using to create accounts or post transactions. And so just having hooks into those APIs as part of your pipeline and then going and running your automated tests. We could run tests much more reliable, much faster, and be very clear on where the issue was. But test data is very critical. When I was at Lincoln, one of the first problems people came to me with was environments and test data, and saying, okay, we're very constrained. There's a mainframe for our policies. We have our mobile front ends for digital, and we're constrained because of the environments, because of test data. And this is where service virtualization came into play. If I'm building a mobile app and my APIs are not changing, or the backend system is not changing, then I don't need to go create data in those systems. I should be able to stub out the calls to the backend system and use like the full data set that I want in order to hit the front end mobile app. So service virtualization is a great way to remove impediments. Maybe you have a third-party API call that limits, has limitations on the data sets or its availability. Or maybe you have a mainframe system that has, transaction limitations like we did. Using service virtualization, I can stub out those calls. The stubs can be very dynamic these days, so that way you can use your full data set, with the stubbed out service to make sure that the front end is working as it should. And then at some point you can do a true end-to-end test to make sure the happiest of happy path is in place, but you don't need to do that all the time. So service virtualization is a key enabler to removing impediments as you start to move faster, as you start to run automated tests more regular. Like if you have a Capital One, they have a mainframe. When you make a payment on an account, the account is dead. And so being able to use service virtualization to run these tests over and over again, that was just a key enabler. And I always tell people, like, if I took your regression suite and I tried to run it 2 or 3 times in a row, what fails, right? That's a great way to find your impediments. Is it failing because you don't have the environments to scale? Is it failing because you don't have the test data? Is it failing because you have limitations on some of the systems that you're integrated with? This is where service virtualization can help. Also, if you have dependencies on other teams, if you're in a large enterprise and there's an API team that's building the API that the front end team is going to use, and that's how your teams are set up, each of those teams could create a stubbed out service that the other could use in order to build out all of their tests that they need, deploy to production in a off state, and then when everything is ready, just reset the flag and rerun those tests. Becomes a very simple, straightforward process. Just like I was saying earlier, DevOps is about speed and flow. Well, if we have people creating test reports and status reports, that's an impediment. That person's not really adding value. And so we need to enable the team to do things on their own. So 2 really great dashboards. So shameless plug, on the left-hand side, we have Report Portal. This is an open source tool that EPAM puts out there. Many of our clients are using it. Many of our competitors are using it. It's free, it's open source. Report Portal allows you to create dashboards for all of your automation, but the best part of Report Portal is that it uses machine learning or natural language processing to be able to triage through your failed tests and determine why are they failing. So the natural language processing engine can learn your failures and help tell you quickly, is this test failing because of a framework issue? Is it failing because of an application defect? And you'll be able to see all of that information over time. And we have clients now who have integrated Report Portal to their security tests and performance tests as a way to integrate them into the pipeline, and basically use Report Portal more as that automated quality gate. And to me, it's one of the best applications of machine learning in the testing space because it speeds up that triage process. Now, Capital One also has an open source dashboard. It's called Hygeia. It's tough to spell, so that's why I put the CapitalOne.io link here. But Hygeia gives teams dashboards into their build pipeline as well as testing, and it gives the team a view on the health of their ecosystem, so that way they're empowered to go and fix when the pipeline stops. And that's really the key here. We need team to be empowered to fix things when things are broke. We don't want to have to depend on someone writing a defect or a bug report. Frankly, if you're a mature team and you've got automation in your pipeline, the need to log defects starts to disappear because the team is communicating enough and the developers are empowered to know when something's not working, that the need to log a defect goes away because everybody's in the loop and accountable. So in order to really get to continuous testing, the other change here is that testers have to be engineers. there still is manual testing. Don't get me wrong, but we need to be automating first. And so, now you're seeing more people who are automation engineers who are able to write, test, who understand the programming. There's an emergence of software engineers in test, or software developers in test, SDETs. So these are technical people who have some type of programming background, who understand CI, who understand automation principles, who are able to sit into teams, and then obviously architects who are able to build out the frameworks and whatnot. Frankly, I tell people, if you have recs for manual testers, you should close them. And you should only be hiring automation engineers. Even if you're not fully ready for everything that I'm talking about, you have to be more technical. You need testers who are more technical, who understand the application architecture and how to test it. That's going to help propel you and pull you forward. We do have some clients who have gone to just teams of developers, but I will tell you that it's my experience that that doesn't last. The teams of developers definitely are more technical, and they definitely have an automation first mindset. But frankly, most developers don't want to do testing, and they don't have a true testing mindset, in the sense that they just going to write tests to verify that something works. They don't really understand edge cases. They don't really understand integration. And almost every client that we have that has gone to teams of engineers at some point is bringing in a testing leader, at some point bringing in BDD or something else to give them a more holistic view. So, be careful when people say we want teams of engineers. I agree with that, but you still are going to have engineers with a developer mindset who are going to focus more on developing and building capabilities, and testers who are technical enough to understand the code and the architecture and the infrastructure, but bring in that testing mindset. At EPAM, we developed this maturity model. So it's something that we use. So when we start working with a client, we do some level of assessment or discovery in order to figure out like where are they at, where are they going, and then how to build a backlog to help them. I will tell you that most companies are somewhere between developing and engaging. So they have regression automated. Maybe they have some level of API tests and some metrics, but they don't have automated quality gates. They don't have the dashboarding in place. They aren't using service virtualization or solving for test data. And so this, the developing and engaging is where majority of companies are. And even if you go and look at the DevOps research and assessment, the DORA report, they do a report every year, the state of DevOps, you're going to see similar information. As you go through this journey, I wanted to put this slide in here because I do think that moving to continuous testing does take time. I've written a couple articles about how I personally feel that this is the first step of the DevOps process, the DevOps transformation process, because it's going to take you time. If you have hundreds of testers, to get them to change the way that they work, to get them to be more technical, to bring in these new capabilities, that is going to take time. It's going to take change management, etc. But even as you're going through that process, you can't do it by yourselves. And so like a full transformation does require that the architecture of the application starts to change. If you have a big monolithic application and all of the business logic is in the UI, you're not getting to continuous testing. You're going to be constrained that you are going to have to write UI tests, which means that they are going to be after the fact, and they are going to be flaky, and they are going to require some support. You're just not going to get around bad architecture. If you're not agile, yes, you can get some benefits of moving in this direction, but obviously getting small slices of business intent, that's going to help propel the team to go faster. If the developers don't write code that's not automatable, if they have bad branching patterns, if they do zero unit testing, if they don't have the quality gates built into the process, you're not going to get to continuous testing. You're going to write your tests, they're all going to fail, and then you're just going to spend time fixing them. It's just going to be this constant circle. And then from an infrastructure perspective, you know, we need to be able to take advantage of the cloud. At Capital One, some of the first cloud experts were in the testing space. As each of the lines of business were working through their migration strategy and how to set up their VPCs and subnets, we were able to stand up all of our test environment for running our Selenium tests, for our performance and security tests, and it was the QA people who started to get more comfortable using Docker and containers and AWS than in some of our lines of business. And so that you definitely will get you know, efficiencies by knowing that. But if the application itself isn't elastic and scalable through infrastructure as code, you're going to have some limitations. So it's important, again, as you go through this, you need to understand what best practices look like, how to communicate them with your development counterparts, and how to help translate this to your business. So let's talk a little bit more about that. So you're listening to this webinar, you're really excited about DevOps and the way of working. And so you're trying to figure out, like, how do I go and apply this to my company? So the first step is value stream analysis. No client of ours is just willing to do best practice. Like, they have to understand what's the return on investment for them. In many cases, the testing budget is constrained and they don't want to spend any more money on testing. So you have to be able to explain to them, like, what's going to be better. And by going through value stream mapping, value stream analysis, it allows you to document how's the process working today? How long does it take for code to go from being committed all the way through to production? What is that lead time? How much time do we spend in our teams fixing defects? How inefficient are the teams? And so by being able to go through value stream analysis as a team, you can identify where the manual wait times are, where the bottlenecks are, and then you can start to build a backlog for how to get started and have a baseline of metrics. At the end of the day, if you want to do this, you have to be able to sell it. You have to be able to tell people, tell the business, tell leadership, hey, if you make an investment in testing, maybe we can go from a 3-month lead time to 2 weeks or 4 weeks. You know, if we look at the backlog of teams, and 40% of the teams are spending time on defect fixing or production issues, well, here's an opportunity where if we were to implement quality gates in this way of working, maybe we could get 20, 30% more efficient in our backlog. That means more features out the door for the business. If every production release requires a hot fix, you probably have a pretty sizable support organization making changes and supporting production. Improvements in quality are going to help reduce that step. You have to be able to find those key metrics, those key business points, to be able to articulate and prioritize the work that needs to be done. And so to me, if there's anything that you take away from this exercise or this webinar, is to go back and do value stream analysis with your team and understand how you work, what's slowing you down, what are those metrics, and then how to build your backlog to start to make improvements. In order to get people involved and bought into what we want to do, the best thing is to get them to eat their own dog food or drink their own champagne. Put them on teams, make them part of the process. Once we go through that value stream analysis, you're going to get a large backlog of changes that need to be done. You are going to need people to do that work. And so by putting people into Agile teams, designating people as product owners and Scrum Masters, and then doing demos and planning events, like, this is a great way to get people bought into what's changing and part of the process to evolve, because organizational change management is a big hurdle to get over. But if they're in the loop, if they understand what's happening and why, and they're part of the decisioning process, like, they're going to be much more willing to accept the changes. And especially if your organization is still new with Agile, creating Agile teams to drive improvements in your area is a great way for people to get more comfortable with the tooling, with how the Agile processes, And so it's just a great way to get people educated, you know, a couple different fronts. You need to socialize. The challenge with organizational change management is that people need to see it, they need to feel it, like there's a lot of touch points here. And so whether it was Capital One or Lincoln or even our clients today, we try to, you know, do a lot of these different things. We have demos. So, you know, whether it's every month or every couple months, you're demoing, you know, the changes and the improvements that you're making. At Lincoln, we did this once a month. We brought in all of the development leadership. And because the changes that testing was making, it put a lot of pressure on development and architecture and infrastructure to do something similar, because here we are starting to put pressure on them that, hey, we're automating more, we're running our tests more, we need environments, we need data, we need these other things, and you need to start stepping up to do this. As you're transitioning to automation, lunch and learns are really great to get people more comfortable with the different tooling, the different way of working. It's just something to get, even if they're ready or not, just to get them more acclimated to the new way of working. At Capital One, we rolled out internal conferences. We did the same thing at Lincoln, and I know other people are doing it now. But being, you know, in a large organization, you typically have some pockets of people doing this type of work, and getting them together, talking about how it's working. That's a great way to drive adoption and help the network internally to the company. Somebody at your company who's doing something, who solved one of these problems, it's much easier for you to reuse what they did than bringing in a vendor to have them do something different. And so being able to socialize the goodness that's happening within the company is a great way to drive momentum. I love open spaces. It's a type of conference where you get people talking and sharing and asking questions. And they can be very powerful when you're trying to drive big change like this. As I mentioned earlier, your technical teams are going to need to have office hours. We need to give people the opportunity to ask questions and get support. And so you need to have office hours, like a set schedule where people can either show up or dial into a bridge line and ask questions and get some help. Maybe you set up Slack channels for people to ask questions, but you need to be able to have a way of supporting those who are working in this new fashion. And then roadshows, like just being able to socialize all the advancements and things that you're doing to drive change. Okay. Everything here that I talked about has some challenges to it. And so I just wanted to make sure that I highlighted a couple of these. So the first one is funding. Like, let's be honest, people just don't put a lot of money into testing, and even the money they do have, they want it to be less. And so now we're asking to go from manual to more automation. Well, guess what? Automation testers cost more money. And you might need to make some investment to solve these things that I've talked about. So you're going to need money. To me, again, it goes back to value stream analysis, being able to create the business case. But sometimes there are like these digital initiatives or other type of initiatives at your company. And so you have to be able to identify those types of, you know, really key to the CIO, CTO type of projects, and how do you enable or embed this type of working into those projects? Because, you know, those projects have some funding. If you can hook onto them, then you're able to, you know, show people how this works, and then you can start to make the business case for why other areas need to change. I mentioned the second one before, but if your company works by projects, you know, that's going to slow you down, because that project delivery mindset really kills innovation. If people have to be accountable for where they're logging their time, you know, all hours of the day, then when you want them to do something new and different, they're going to have an issue. And so, you know, being able to get away from projects and project heroics and get into products and start to reward people for driving these capabilities, that's how you start to drive change. If you have a lot of vendors, that can hurt you based on how your contracts are written, or it can help you. At Lincoln, I was able to lean on our vendors to bring in automation people because of the way the contracts are written. Automation was part of what they were accountable for, and I was able to lean on them to bring people with experience. At Capital One, I had to train 1,000+ testers to do automation, which is very tough. But sometimes with your vendors, you're able to have them swap people out for more technical resources who can do this work, and that it can, depending on how your contract written, it could hurt you or help you. You're going to get a lot of questions from everybody on what you're doing and why, etc. And that's where the road shows, the demos, the internal conferences, that's where they have value, because you can get people up to speed and educated and in the know, so that way they help pull you along, and you'll find who your advocates are and where it's easy to work. And then the last one is, you just might not have technical people. And so part of what you'll have to do is figure out, like, who are the most technical people within our testing organization? How do we pull them out and put them into more enterprise roles where they're helping drive capabilities and knowledge sharing? And like I said, if you have open recs, you should be using them to bring technical people in, not manual testers. As I was saying, so enterprise people, they're focused on providing capabilities and support, while our Agile teams are focused on shippable code. So that's when we talk about applying DevOps to testing and how testing changes, it's that the testers on the teams need to be able to do everything that's needed to certify that code all the way through to production. So they need to be able to understand what the CI pipeline is and how to automate and how to hook their automation into the CI process. They need to be able to handle service virtualization and test data management. They need to be able to make sure that they're working within the dashboards and that they understand the architecture of the application. In essence, they're getting more, they have to be more technical to take advantage of these capabilities, to be able to focus on, you build it, you own it. And then lastly, it's really important that you do pilots. People just don't buy into this. As much as like I could talk till I'm blue in the face, it's not until they see it within their own eyes. At Capital One, we did one pilot first. Then we had to go to the CIO. We showcased the capabilities and why it was so much better. Then each divisional CIO created a pilot, and then we worked within their teams to show them. And then from that, we scaled it out. And very similar, even if I was going to work with your company today, we would start with 1 or 2 applications. We would uplift them to be able to demonstrate what this really means in your terms, because it goes back to that investment, that ROI. How are you going to be better from this investment? Like, what is the opportunity for the business? Being able to articulate that and showcase this is how it's different and why it's better. Like, that's how you get buy-in. That's how it scales out. Otherwise, people get it, but they're not willing to spend money on it because they don't really understand how it's going to be better for them in the long run. So that's it for me. I'm ready to take questions. I think we have like 10 minutes left. So if you have questions, there is a question panel. I'm happy to answer what you have. You can always ping me on Twitter, or you can connect with me on LinkedIn, and I'm happy to answer questions there as well. So Magdi, I don't see the questions. I don't know.
There's only one question there. I've been answering the simple ones, but there is one question. It says one of the tenets of high quality enterprise software is to ensure integration / end-to-end testing has been with other systems. Is there a way out without relying on service virtualization and the mock data for continuous testing?
Yeah, I mean, you have to be able to test those components independently. So you have to be able to isolate like the UI layer and the different APIs and the back end. You have to be able to write tests to isolate those components. And you can hit those components very robustly. And then when it comes time to doing like real integration or end-to-end testing, you can just focus on the happiest of happy paths. So you don't necessarily need to use service virtualization. I mean, I can write tests to hit an API and validate the responses without service virtualization, but it helps. But yes, that is part of the change. You have to be able, like, you shouldn't be writing all of your tests as end-to-end tests or integration tests. You should be only using them to verify connectivity and critical transactions.
Another question, which tools do you recommend to bring testing transformation?
So I am a big proponent of open source tools. I think open source tools really force you to be more technical. They allow you to do more customization. There are really great third-party tools. Tricentis is a partner of EPAM. I know there's the robot framework and there's other tooling. But a lot of times those tools have abstraction layers that can be crutches. And ultimately, a tool that creates like a bridge for manual testers to do automation is going to be short-lived. At some point, your testers will need to get more technical. At some point, they're going to want to use the open source tools and write the code themselves. And so you just have to balance your decision process. But Selenium right now is the most popular tool that people are using.
Another question here. How do you include manual/exploratory testing of UI in continuous integration and continuous delivery?
So another shameless plug. So we have a crowdsourced company called Test.io that's part of EPAM. And so we have many companies that will use the crowd. So as part of their pipeline, they'll send out a request to the crowd to do that exploratory or ad hoc testing as part of the process. It's not a critical step in the pipeline. So they have all of their automation in place for their critical transactions, but they're using the crowd. And so you could do something similar. You can still have a step in the process where you're doing some manual testing, whether it's internally or using the crowd, but it just wouldn't be part of the critical step.
All right. Another question that you might have addressed in the previous answer. What about automation framework? What is your insight on it?
There really isn't one standard. We have an open source framework that if you need something, we have an open source framework called JDI. What I find is that every company has their own frameworks. It's very easy to build stuff today. The question is, how have you written it? Did you have automation engineers write your framework, or did you have developers? Because when we run analysis of automation frameworks, most times we find that the code is poorly written. Like they haven't used object-oriented methodology. It's not very maintainable. It doesn't have reusable components. And so the framework is a little less important than it is on who wrote it and how good it is. And so just like everything else, like if you have Sonar for code analysis, you should have Sonar for your automation framework. You should have a pipeline for your automation framework. It should be in Git if you use Git. Like all of the best coding practices, your framework should be following. And as long as you make sure that's happening and you can support testing at the different levels, you'll be fine.
Okay, another question. Where do you see business line acceptance testing fitting into this?
You have to be very careful with business acceptance testing because it's basically a bottleneck. It's the business not trusting what IT is doing. And so frankly, it needs to be, if it's not eliminated, it needs to be really short-lived. And so as you're moving through your Agile transformation, my recommendation would be to make the business, your business part of your demos and acceptance of stories. So if you can get the business to be the one that's accepting the stories, then you can limit the bottleneck that becomes. But if you have a rigid business acceptance testing phase, what's going to happen is you're going to do everything that, like we said, the code's going to go there, and then it's going to stop, and they're going to find a bunch of stuff. And frankly, it becomes a bottleneck. And if your business feels they have the need to do this, then that means the testing group isn't doing their job. So really, you should be finding ways to eliminate the need for doing it. And how do you bring them into the process earlier? BDD is a great way to get the business up front with the acceptance criteria. And then if you work them into the demos and you're testing everything that they would test and you give them those results, you should be able to really limit the amount of it.
Well, the next question, I don't know if you need an hour to answer that. Are there any books and or websites for someone who does not have experience with automation testing and wants to learn it?
So Magdi, you have
I can answer that. I mean, just to go to Testing Institute website or other. I mean, our website already have at least 15 different courses on test automation and certification and so on. That's you can start there, or there are other. I mean, if you Google test automation courses, you'll get thousands of pages on that.
Yeah, just a shameless plug for Applitools. So they have an evangelist, Angie Jones. She used to work at Twitter, so she has done a lot around education. They have a whole university for automation and courses that you can take. So that's another one.
All right, another question. What about codeless automation?
Yes, codeless automation to me is again like short-sighted. Yes, like there are ways and tools out there to build scripts, but they're not as maintainable as if you wrote the code yourself. They're still going to be from the UI, so they're going to have the same flaws that UI automation has. You know, it can be a way to get started, but ultimately you're still going to need technical people. You're still going to need to be able to get into the code and make sure that you have all the layers of your application covered.
All right, another question. To grow towards enterprise organization, would you suggest it to start the pilot program and analysis with the internal teams, or try to get help from a third-party experts?
Yeah, I think it's preference. If you were to reach out to me and my company, like we can help you very quickly because we know how to do it and this is what we do. But if you have people at your company who have some of this experience and you have some leaders that are supportive, then definitely, you know, go at it on your own. When I was at Capital One, like it was so new that there just wasn't people in the market and we had to kind of figure it out ourselves. But as we started to grow and scale, we needed to bring in third parties because we just didn't have enough experienced people to do it. And that, you know, sometimes clients will bring us in, we'll do one app, we'll run their pilot, and then they will take it over from there. There's a couple different ways to go about it. It really becomes your preference. But definitely finding a leader that's supportive, finding people that have some of this experience, starting with a pilot to be able to show people how it works and why it's better in a business terms, like that is the best way to get started.
Another question on tools, is Azor DevOps good platform for transformation to start with?
If you're a .NET shop, yes. Microsoft has done a lot with Azor DevOps. Everything that I talked about today will work with Azor DevOps. You can hook your automation right into that. It can be part of the development process with quality gates. They have some of the dashboarding built in. Yes.
Okay, how does crowd testing stop a build?
So I can't speak to all the different vendors, but I know for our platform, we have integration capabilities. So we can integrate into Jenkins, for example, and to Jira. And so if you create like a 2-hour window for the crowd to run tests, we can go back and like through an API to say stop the build. And that would be the key. It's how well you've integrated your crowd testing into your process itself.
All right, George is saying that the second link, the report portal.io did not work. I wonder if you can provide another link.
It might be the company's firewall. Sometimes because it's a .io link, it doesn't work, but
yeah,
I'm just looking at it myself right now. Okay, I'll double check it to make sure it's up.
George, please confirm if this is the link really you want. Another question from Kurt. Have you seen AI/machine learning integrated into automated testing?
Yes. There's a bunch of different startups now. There's Pink Lion, there's Test.ai from Jason Arbon. Um, there's a handful of new startups. So like I mentioned with Report Portal, we're using machine learning to help with results. I think that obviously AI and machine learning is still emerging. I think the biggest use case is possibly the ability to determine which tests should be run based on code changes. So being able to run the analysis around your code changes and your corresponding tests and the data sets to identify which tests should be run, but it's still emerging. That's why I said like the report portal, using that to help triage, like especially security tests. You get a lot of false fails. Using machine learning to identify like a true failure. Like, this is a great use case.
Well, it's 2 minutes beyond our time, but I need to ask Adam to see how many more minutes he's willing to put in. I still have about 6-7 questions available.
Okay, let's keep going.
All right. What's your advice for a team which has zero automation? How can they start on it?
The developers need to do it. And so if you go through the value stream analysis and you look at how the team is working today, most likely you can find that there is time for the developers to write some of the automation. So what I've seen is that if you went with like BDD, behavioral driven development, and the testers wrote Gherkin acceptance tests, and you had the developers, maybe they do some pair programming where they're sitting together, but the developers are writing the test, the automation code. This is a great way to get them educated and better understanding of how they have to write their code and how the automation should work. And break down some of the silos. But at some point you might need to replace some of the testers on the team, but getting the developers to do the automation is a great first step.
Right. How far back in the life cycle should the value flow analysis go?
It's really, so for testing purposes, I would say like start with you have an accepted story for the sprint. If you're like looking at the entire IT value stream, then you might want to look at your projects or how intent comes in. But I would only do that if I was looking at this from more of an agile perspective. How do they prioritize the features? How are you doing release planning? If I'm looking at it from an agile perspective, then I would start like from scoping. But if we're talking about automation and refining the IT process, I would just say you have an accepted story, start there.
All right. How do you ensure that automation is defect-free? Is there such a thing? And that it does cover what it needs to cover?
There are tools in the market now. I know we're building one tool. There are tools like there's a Israeli company called Socialize, SEALIGHTS.io. So Socialize instruments your code and it gives you code coverage metrics. So you could see which methods have been touched by which tests, manual or automated or performance. So there's more and more tools coming up in the marketplace to show you like true code coverage. Because the way we do code coverage today, based on like business requirements, it doesn't work. All
right. This automation code may not outright fail, but that does not mean it works. That's to say, it may not test what it claims to test. I don't know if this is a comment or a question.
Well, I would just say, just like anything else, your automation code needs to be refined and refactored. We know that when new functionality gets introduced, the test at that point has its highest value. But as code ages, the tests go down. And so you do have to be refining and refactoring your suite of tests. And frankly, this is why you do have to have an understanding of coverage for your automation, because many times we just don't have the right coverage because it's based off of manual test cases or business function versus real method level understanding.
Okay, are there tools which can help in defect prediction?
Not the only ones that I would say would be, again, like those code coverage tools, to ensure that you have all of the new methods covered and that you're tracking traceability. But that would be it.
Okay, how about tools for generating test cases directly from requirements? Well, that's a bigger question.
Yeah, I mean, I think that kind of goes into some of the scriptless stuff. And there are tools out there that do that, but I don't know that you're going to get, most of those requirements are going to be UI focused, and so you're not going to get the right level of tests for what you're trying to do.
All right. George is saying that he loves your suggestion for moving from project mindset to product mindset. How have you been able to accomplish this change in a large enterprise that's service-driven and not product-driven?
It does take time. The key is find. So usually what ends up happening, or ultimately what end up happening, is that organization has to go through some restructuring, because typically how the teams are aligned isn't proper. And that might even mean like how the senior leadership is aligned isn't the right way. So you really have to find a leader, some area who gets it, who's willing to take a risk and make the changes, and then be able to socialize that with others. It's an exercise in change management, being able to start small and then being able to socialize how that's different. But like at Capital One, it happened because we started out as the Agile teams weren't correct. We were following SAFe. And then when you do release planning, it would be very clear on all of the dependencies on other teams and how and the impediments. And so by bringing that up to leadership and constantly showing them the dependencies and impediments on others, you can start to get them to realize for themselves, hey, we need to realign the teams. Maybe we need to realign some of the organizations. Maybe we need to be better aligned to the business because of how priorities are happening. So the more you can do to shed light on the impediments that are occurring because of the dependencies on teams or organizations, the more informed leadership can be to make those discussions. There's also a book, it's called Project to Product by Mick Kirsten from TaskTop. So that's a good book to read as well. A lot of good information and metrics around how to help drive change.
Right. I have two more questions left. This question is mostly about the designing the tests. It says most of our production defects are due to missing scenarios, mainly due to application knowledge gap. How can we prevent this?
This is where BDD can really help. So if bringing in business SMEs into the process early to help shed light on how the end users are going to be using the application. That's a great way. Also making, looking at how are you monitoring production? Do you have tools in place that allow you to see the user journeys and experience? Because then what you could do is model your testing after how the users are really using the application in production.
Okay, and one last question. What approach do you use for automating E2E testing?
So again, you can use Selenium, but I would, again, focus on automating the happy paths, the critical transactions that have to be in place, and all of your edge cases and all of the more robust tests would be done at a component level, but all of the same tools will work. You just, this is where the coordination of data becomes a little bit more critical, but the same tools would apply.
All right, Adam, I really want to thank you so much for giving us your time today, knowing your very busy travel schedule. Thanks for sharing your experience and your knowledge. Thanks for giving the additional time, 11 minutes beyond our time here to answer questions. That's really very generous and very professional of you. Thank you so much again. I personally appreciate your time. I personally learned a lot from your webinar today. Thanks for serving the community with your webinar. Thanks to everyone else who attended the webinar. Please know that, as I said, the webinar is being recorded and the recording will be available at the Testing Institute website next week, and you should be receiving an email with that. Again, Adam, thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.